I've already reviewed Fallout New Vegas, so I may as well review the game that brought the series truly into 3D in the first place. No, not you. Hey, could someone go take this abomination out back in Old Yeller, please? Thanks. No, I mean the first one made by Bethesda, described as Oblivion with guns. If you somehow haven't caught on by now, I'm talking about Fallout 3. It just turned 11 years old, so now's as good a time as any to delve into how it stacks up. Okay, I feel this warrants more of an explanation than my New Vegas review since it came first. Since it's the one that brought the series in open world 3D, it's obviously not going to be like previous Fallout games, at least not entirely. Unlike the classic turn-based 2D Fallout games, this one is completely real-time, either in first or third person depending on what your preference is. Well, except for the baby section, it's locked into first person, but that's probably so you don't realize you're just a really tiny adult. As a compromise, you have a system called VATS that allows you to target body parts with a % chance of hitting depending on how close you are to your target. You do have a limited amount of action points to use it with, and I guess people who prefer turn-based RPGs will get a lot of traction out of this, but I didn't really find myself using it much outside of maybe very tight situations. You can pick your major in explosives, guns, big guns, melee, unarmed, and/or energy weapons. Me personally, I'm a big fan of sci-fi, so I like to go with energy weapons. The energy weapons you get in the Mothership Zeta DLC are especially gratifying, I must say. Of course, you probably have a different preference, and the game is more than happy to oblige you in whatever way you see fit. Isn't it nice actually having options in an RPG, Bethesda? Or maybe you don't like fighting much and would prefer to go big on speech, science, lockpicking, or the like. It's really up to you for the most part. You might want to have some kind of combat skill when the game forces you into a fight. You can't just talk your way out of every single encounter, so bear that in mind. Or if you want to, you can just rely on a companion who knows how to shoot or fight for you. You get your pick of 3 skills to focus on from the beginning, with more skill points to distribute from there, and you can choose from SPECIAL, or just special. Each of these attributes has its own perks, but you generally want to have high intelligence as soon as possible because it gives you more skill points to distribute with every level. As I mentioned in the Fallout New Vegas review, which by the way if you haven't seen is in a card above, Fallout 3 uses a percentage-based chance of passing speech checks. The same is also implemented in Fallout 4, so it seems to just be a Bethesda thing. Granted, having higher speech gives you a higher chance of succeeding, but it still seems pretty pointless when you can just save scum around it. Still, it's not that big of a deal, and you can always choose not to save scum if you don't want to. Returning from previous Fallout games is the karma system. It's heavily emphasized here since there are no faction reputations, and how high or low it is dictates how the people of the Waste treat you. Of course, if you just want to increase it, you can just keep giving purified water to the beggar outside of Megaton, you'll be a saint in no time. Or if you want to be the ultimate bad guy, nuke Megaton! Which is also an option. Either way, getting it too high or low will get some groups hunting your backside, so be wary of that. Perhaps the one aspect that's aged the most poorly is the gunplay. Fallout New Vegas mildly improved it by adding an iron sight, and Fallout 4 improved it by a lot in that regard, but 3 is still the awkward first child. You have the option to zoom, but without a scope it just zooms it in slightly, which is really awkward. Part of me thinks they added in VATS as a bandage to this. Now, getting that ugly business out of the way, I'd say the best part of the game is probably the best of New Vegas, and what I mean is the ability to roam around the pretty massive wasteland as you go around looking for stuff to do. You can discover locations, wander around in random vaults where some twisted experiments happen, and even get some neat little side quests. Naturally, the game heavily emphasizes and encourages exploration, and you can find some pretty nice goodies hanging around somewhere if you know where to look. All in all, the gameplay is just fine for what it is. Much like with New Vegas, I heavily recommend mods if you want to get the most out of it because it certainly hasn't aged well. In other words, don't get it for the PS3 or 360 unless you have to. Still, for being its first real forte into a 3D Fallout game, it does okay. Certainly vastly better than what can technically be considered Fallout's first 3D game. No, hey, I said to get this game out of my face. Where's the firing squad when you need them?
War never changes. Since the dawn of humankind, when our ancestors first discovered the killing power of rock and bone, blood has been spilled in the name of everything from God to justice to simple psychotic rage.
Fallout 3 takes place in the capital wasteland, so basically the Washington, D.C. area after the nukes fell down. To put it shortly, in the Fallout universe, tensions with China led to nukes being dropped en masse, with humanity devastated, especially in the US. Your main character starts in Vault 101, one of the many vaults made by Vault-Tec to run experiments on people after the nuclear apocalypse started. The experiment being run in your vault just happens to be an overseer with an extreme god complex. Lucky pick, am I right? It starts with you as a baby, moves into your childhood and career test, then you're an adult and dad just left. His friend Jonas is killed, your childhood friend Amada hands you a gun unless you tell her not to, and you have to get out of the vault. It certainly lives up to the old adage. That escalated quickly. After finally making your way out for the first time, you're graced with the wastelands, and I'll admit that first time your character adjusts to the light and the wasteland comes to view, it's quite a sight. From there, you're free to do more or less your own thing, but the game really wants you to find your dad, and the family obligation makes it a little awkward. Still, an open-world RPG is an open-world RPG. Sorry, dear old dad, you'll have to make do wherever you are while I go off screwing around and doing my own thing for the next forever. Eventually, though, you'll probably find him and are basically spearheaded into a conflict between the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave. Probably the most interesting thing about it is when you find your dad, James, you find him in a virtual reality world where he's being tormented by a little girl who's actually an old man. Insert joke here about how this is a common thing on the internet with middle-aged men pretending to be young girls. Anyway, you get him out and there's a project to purify literally all water in the wasteland. You know, somehow. I guess the Gek is just that amazing, although it was apparently originally meant to be a farming device, but we can say it's just a different model or something. The Enclave, of course, comes swarming in, and even though you could probably rip through them like tissue paper at this point if you didn't go straight into the main story when you started, regardless, James sacrifices himself and irradiates the main chamber. Now, you have to get the Gek from here, likely getting assistance from one of the two friendly super mutants of the wasteland, Fox. And no, I didn't say Fox, I said Fox. I understand the pronunciation can get pretty confusing. Of course, you can always try to get it yourself, but you'd need a crap ton of radiation resistance and rataways to pull that off. It's much easier just to get the radiation-proof guy in the room to do it. And hooray, after you get it, you're kidnapped by the Enclave in an unavoidable cutscene and meet the President, who is actually a robot. Pretty sure that goes against the constitutional requirements for being a president, but sure, this is Fallout, just roll with it. He wants you to infect the water with a modified EFV that basically kills all the mutants in the wasteland. Even if you ignore the fact the wasteland is full of a lot of friendly ghouls and two nice super mutants, he leaves out that basically includes everyone in the wasteland because they're all mutated to varying degrees. In keeping with that classic Fallout charm, you can also convince him to self-terminate, after which you have to run away. I'll admit though, what happens next is pretty awesome. The Brotherhood of Steel has a giant robot called Liberty Prime, obviously a American version of Optimus Prime, and he takes his patriotism very seriously because you'll be hearing anti-communism quotes all the way into the Project Purity area. From there, you have to confront the Enclave General, either talking him out of it or just shooting him. After that, you either have to do the task yourself in the heavily irradiated chamber, or send someone else to do it. In the base game, it's basically you or Sarah because your two radiation-proof companions will flat out refuse to do it if you ask them to. The game obviously wants you to sacrifice yourself, but you can always send Sarah in if you're a douche. Broken Steel finally allows you to send in one of those radiation-proof companions, which makes far more sense because they won't die and have no risk on themselves at all, but the game still treats you like a coward for doing so. Rather than die a needless death, the Vault Dweller chose to send in Fox because he's immune to radiation and is in no danger whatsoever. What a pansy. Thankfully in Broken Steel, even if you do go in yourself just to be a badass, you still survive, which I ended up doing. You're basically forced to side with the Brotherhood of Steel throughout the main game, although you do get the option of inflicting the drinking water with the FEV. Basically, that means dooming the entire Capital Wasteland in the process. This is what I meant when I said in my Fallout New Vegas review that the Bethesda's options in these games tend to be black and white to the extreme. You can either save Megaton or blow it up. You can either provide clean water to the entire wasteland, thus saving humanity, or you can doom them all to death. In Broken Steel, you can either blow up the Enclave's hideout, or you can turn it on your own Brotherhood of Steel allies, the latter of which makes no sense. There is one exception, however. There is a quest that's surprisingly nuanced, in that there's no right answer. There's a ghoul named Roy Phillips who's denied access into Tenpenny Tower, a snobby community helmed by Tenpenny himself. Tenpenny is actually the guy who wants to blow up Megaton in that quest, but that's beside the point. You can help Tenpenny Tower by exterminating the ghouls and feral ghouls down below, or you can help them sneak in through the basement to exterminate the residents. But don't worry, it's not completely black and white, there is a third option. You can convince Tenpenny and everyone in it to let the residents in, although some get upset and leave. Still, the ghouls are fully integrated and the people who are left are accepting of them. So wonderful, we got our great big happy full white ending, right? Well, no, you find out that Roy killed them all secretly, except for the blow-up Megaton guy because he really hates smooth skins. I'll admit, that was surprisingly nuanced for Bethesda, giving you the illusion of the perfect ending and then it all goes to hell because ultimately Roy is just as bigoted as Tenpenny is. When you see two hateful people who want to kill each other, sometimes the best option is to just not get involved. Sadly, that's an exception to the rule here, and most of the moral choices are pretty much black and white for the most part. While Fallout 4 would take from New Vegas' lead and give you a choice of factions, 3 is pretty straightforward in that regard. Now, I've bashed on 3's plot relentlessly, but there is some merit to it. While it does railroad you down a certain path, it's still ultimately a pretty well-told story, and the voice acting is about as good as New Vegas, which is surprisingly good.
We don't usually have exposure to the public like this. It's nice to know someone's listening.
Obviously, the highlight in the game for me is when you're following Liberty Prime, because he's memetically awesome. The only moment in New Vegas that can compete is having a massive Securitron army with either the House or the Yes Man path. Ultimately, if you go in expecting a linear story that doesn't give you very many options, it's still a very good story that really pulls at your heartstrings sometimes. Bethesda's writing can't compete with what Obsidian did with New Vegas. You certainly won't find any villains explaining in depth their ideology, but it's a nice straightforward tale nonetheless. It's only a shame that it doesn't give you enough options, especially for being an open-world RPG game. I know that's not exactly uncommon, and I'm probably spoiled by New Vegas, but some more nuance would be a little nice. At least the DLC has some pretty cool moments, the overall family plot is nice, and unearthing the twisted experiments that took place in some of the vaults can be pretty intense. Believe it or not, that fun little vault with the Garrett clones has a surprisingly morbid backstory behind it, and they're really set up to fail. Now, just like with Fallout New Vegas, the game hasn't aged all that well due to a very ugly filter over everything. Now, thankfully, the same realistic lighting wasteland mod that I recommended for New Vegas is also available for 3, and it works wonders in both of them. On a serious note, I'm really glad that that trend of bathing everything in one color, mostly a brownish color, came to an end. There's not even really that much of an excuse here, since Oblivion looks so beautiful in the same engine. I know it's a wasteland, but Fallout 4 managed to be much more colorful, so clearly they realized it didn't look very appealing here. Now, there is one exception. Even in the vanilla, the area with Harold is a real highlight moment. There's foliage everywhere. It's a real oasis in the sea of greenish muck, otherwise infecting the rest of the wasteland. Another point visually is in Point Lookout when you're hallucinating. It gets really trippy, and you can tell they pull out all the stops and screwing around with you. There are even bobbleheads that flat out make fun of you and all this other kind of stuff, like your own birth. I also really enjoyed Mothership Zeta from an aesthetical point. I'm probably biased on that front because I'm a huge fan of sci-fi, but it really spoke to me on that. When I played through it on my live streams, I even deliberately set it up as much as possible to be an unofficial player base, just because I love the look of it. It's certainly a lot cooler than the dilapidated look around the rest of the wasteland. If you're gonna go that route though, I suggest getting a mod to unlock the rest of the ship. In my humble little opinion, that was really stupid to lock most of it out once you beat it. It's so much cooler to just roam the ship with maybe a few straggler aliens here and there to worry about. Operation Anchorage was also pretty cool to go through in that it basically took you into the past when the US was still in conflict with China before the bombs really fell. Apparently it was a training simulation to take back Alaska, which China apparently stole for some reason. The pit isn't as nice to look at. It's basically covered in an orange rust color, but I suppose that's at least a nice contrast from the usual green-yellow. In short, the game does have some visually impressive moments, honestly mostly in the DLC, so you'll want to get the Game of the Year edition if you want the most out of that. And on PC, you can even get mods! The voice acting, as I mentioned before, is just fine. Your character's father, James, is voiced by Liam Neeson, and he's really nice to listen to. He's played a number of roles, including the good cop, bad cop in the Lego movie. Obviously, the real highlight moment is the opening spouted by Ron Perlman. It's always a delight just hearing him talk about everything that happened, followed up with that famous line,
War never changes.
The radio songs are overall pretty good, but the obvious highlight is Butcher Pete. I'll admit it's a pretty amusing song to listen to about a guy basically running around butchering everyone. It has this lovely little 1950s cheery happy-go-lucky vibe to contrast with the morbidity of the lyrics. I still use a custom radio though because YouTube copyright flagging, but the songs that are already there are fine enough. In general, the best aspect about it is that they tend to be very happy-go-lucky 1950s songs, which flies in the face of you mostly ripping through people and creatures in a brutal fashion. Basically like with Fallout New Vegas, the voice acting and the audio in general has aged much better than the visuals, although the latter can be fixed with mods. My opinion on this front is mostly the same there, although I'll admit there are moments in the DLC that are quite nice to look at in any form. Ultimately, Fallout 3 has not aged quite so gracefully. Overall, I'd actually say it's aged more poorly than New Vegas because of the more linear and less complex narrative, and some mechanics that New Vegas would end up improving on, like the zooming being basically useless if you don't have a scoped weapon. Still, it can be a pretty fun experience, and you can get it dirt cheap nowadays in Steam, even the Game of the Year edition. Obviously, I recommend getting that one on Steam and modding it so that you can have a better experience. Getting it like that can still lead to a lot of fun in the Capital Wasteland, just don't expect it to be very polished or complex.
For man had succeeded in destroying the world. But war never changes.